We're in business to save the planet, and we use making clothes to do that. The cure for depression is action. Every one of us has to step up and do what you can according to what your resources are.
That was the voice of Patagonia's Yvonne Chenard, and this is Type 2, a podcast from Looking Sideways in association with Patagonia that explores the intersection between outdoors, action sports and activism. As you're probably gathering by now, each episode I'm meeting people who are using their passion and involvement with the cultures we all love to create change. We're discussing the issues they're involved in, the change they're seeking to create, the difficulties involved and the rewards that follow. My guest for this episode of Type 2 is Dan Yates. Dan lives in Snowdonia in North Wales. He's also one of the people behind Save Our Rivers, an environmental organisation dedicated to protecting our wild rivers and national parks here in the UK. Now, I'd known about Dan and Save Our Rivers for a while, but it was only when I was on the same trip to Norway with him earlier this year that I fully understood the scope of his work. And I've got to say, I was pretty impressed, both by the approach and for the success that they've achieved through that approach. What I learned from Dan is that while activism is intrinsically linked to his own love for wild places, there's much more to it than that. And what comes across from his story, and why I think his story is so valuable, is really what you might call the reality of everyday activism. Dan and his peers are fitting in this work around their very, very busy everyday lives, and in doing so finding hugely effective ways to achieve their goals that don't necessarily rely on direct action of the type that I've covered in previous interviews with the likes of Jack Harries, and instead it means a lot of hard, dedicated and often unglamorous work. And there's huge value in this because one of the themes that's gradually becoming clear as Type 2 evolves, and I speak to more people, is that for activism to really succeed, it needs to be a combination of passion and pragmatism, which is something that Dan and Save Our Rivers epitomise. So it's a really impressive and fascinating story, this one, and Dan tells it really well, which is why I sat down with him at the Kendal Mountain Festival to find out more. See what you reckon. How you doing, Dan?
Yeah, I'm good, Matt.
Yeah,
good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, so we're at Kendal, and you've got a real busy weekend, right?
I have, yeah. So we started last night. We did an event at 8 p.m. last night, Thursday night. So right at the beginning of the festival, there's some proposed engineered flood defence going in Kendal, which is going to involve the loss of a lot of riverside trees and some building of some dams and embankments in the upper catchment.
Oh, right. So it's a topical local issue.
Yeah, so flooding, like big news everywhere in the UK at the moment.
Well, of course, we're talking as there is a very... well, it's a big flood, but it's just causing a lot of headlines, isn't it? Because it's become kind of, subsumed into the election campaigning thing, hasn't it, really? It's suddenly very topical, like what are the parties doing about it, etc.
I think the problem that we're having is when politicians get involved in what essentially is an environmental issue like flooding. Yeah, they put pressure on agencies like the Environment Agency here to act quickly, to make changes quickly. So that often, in the case of flooding, would end up with building flood walls, taking out trees on the riverside, dredging rivers, or building hard engineered structures, which we know is not the correct answer. So we want to look at changing of upland land management, planting of trees, meandering of rivers, returning rivers to their true state where they can store and hold water themselves. But those solutions, even though we can help them along, take 20 years, 25 years. And when the politicians have it as an election piece, people want to see results the next day. And it does skew, environmental policy in a way that perhaps we wouldn't want to see.
Because it's a medium to long-term solution. And then when it gets the glare of that publicity, presumably people are like, what are we doing now? What's the quick fix kind of thing?
Yeah, so last night we hosted a debate with a local activist who's concerned about the damage that's going to be done to the River Kent through this. And we got a natural flood management expert from the Rivers Trust to come and give, the assembled crowd from Kendal, who are all people who are concerned about the flooding, and B, about the proposed damage to the river that these engineered structures will cause, and we just tried to facilitate a bit of a discussion about alternative measures that could be
So how was that taken?
It was really good, actually.
Yeah.
It was really good. The natural flood management expert we got in was brilliant. He spoke really well. The crowd were... It was a bit of a weird one because we weren't sure if we were going to get a crowd which were going to be half, I've had my home flooded, I want this dam built now, and half, I want to save the nature of the uplands. So we presented it as quite a balanced debate. But actually, everybody in the audience there, I think like 60, 70 people, all just wanted to get campaigning and get this construction stopped. And so I think we would have maybe pitched it a bit differently had we known the strength of local feeling. But that's what happens when you start campaigning. You've got to put the feelers out and then see where you need to go forwards from there. Yeah.
I've got a quick question on, you mentioned Upland Management. I'm just interested. So whenever something like this happens in the UK, I mean, I followed George Monbiot on Twitter. He's always talking about the fact that deforestation is a huge reason for the fact that the UK gets flooded a lot, basically. Is that, can you explain that? Is that some, because, and he always gets a lot of criticism from people who say that that's not the point at all, and really what needs to happen is like rivers needs to be dredged more, and because his argument seems to be that, and I'm a total layman here obviously, plant more trees is going to stop it. Is that a what's the sort of thought on that?
So basically flooding is caused by obviously the amount of rain we're getting, and that's increasing with climate change, but the issue is how fast that water moves from the uplands down and hits the town.
Yeah.
So if you're going to dredge a river, if you're going to straighten a river, if you're going to remove vegetation from the upland and make that upland flatter and smoother, that water that lands on that hillside is going to hit that town faster, and it isn't going to be able to drain away in time.
Yeah.
So all you're doing by dredging the river down in the town and building walls is you're putting a sticking plaster on that issue. Whereas what we want to do is basically hold that water up in the uplands. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. First of all is you can give the rivers space. All our rivers are really straight now because they've been, straightened and they've been dredged, and the sides have been reinforced because, landowners don't want erosion of a meandering river taking out part of their land, so that increases the flow, the speed of flow for the water to hit the uplands. If you allow that river to meander and reconnect with that floodplain and flood onto the floodplain in the uplands, it's not going to be flooding in your town.
Right.
Tree planting has got, it's got different aspects in the fact that it stops the sediment and things running off the fields, and it increases the roughness of that terrain, so water runs slower through a rougher terrain. You'll notice, like when you walk around a dense woodland, there's less grass and less surface coverage of vegetation, so it increases the permeability of the soil, so you get more water running down into the soil rather than straight into the river.
Right.
And the final thing the trees do is they're catching that rain in the leaves, and then they're transpiring it back into the atmosphere. So some of the rain doesn't even make it to the ground. So we're intercepting the rain before it's even hit the ground.
So our historical land management has massively contributed to this issue, and the debate now is like how we rectify that essentially. And can you summarise it in that way?
Yeah, I think you totally can. I mean, upland land management has always been about turning land into profit, and whether that's for the number of grouse that you can shoot on that land, whether it's the number of sheep you can get on that land, whether it's the acreage that you can claim a farm subsidy for on that land, so you've got to drain the land to make it suitable to claim your agricultural subsidy. And that has contributed to a degrading of our uplands, so they don't hold carbon properly, they don't hold a high enough level of biodiversity like they used to, and they don't hold water like they used to. And so we're ending up with a situation where it's been tolerable but an issue, but now we've got raising populations, so we're building on floodplains because people need to live somewhere, and we've got not higher rainfall overall, but higher peak rainfall events due to climate change, and it's ended up being a perfect storm. We've got people living in flood-prone areas, we've got higher rainfall events, and we've got this degradation of our uplands, which has been happening for centuries.
Sure.
But in some ways has accelerated more recently. And that's leading to this perfect storm of flooding that we're getting now.
Right. And it's very charged as an issue, isn't it? It almost seems like to be an ideological issue, like what your stance is, like from what I can see, again, in my very slight dabbling in it when I just read stuff online or like, try and follow it in the news or whatever, definitely seems to be, like ideological is probably the word. Like how you propose to tackle it says a lot about your general approach to these issues, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my approach to it, and I'd like to put the caveat here, is that I've never lived in a house that's been flooded, so I can't look at it from the emotional point of view from someone who's lost their possessions or has their house flooded. And I have the utmost sympathy for these people. And obviously it is difficult for me to put myself in their mindset. But, when we were debating this with the Kendall audience last night, lots of those people who are opposing these engineered structures had their houses flooded. So there's people who've been flooded on both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
But my side is, can we continue to engineer our environment to mitigate against the problem that we've caused by engineering our environment?
Sure.
And where does that end?
Yeah.
We need to go back and we need to restore, and it's going to take longer. It isn't going to cost more money, it's going to be cheaper, but people are going to have patience, and we're going to have to accept a change in land use of our uplands, which is going to affect farming and agriculture, and farmers will need to be compensated for that, whether that's through subsidy or through government grants for turning over their land for this use. So that there needs to be a way of compensating the people it'll affect, but it can be done.
Yeah.
There's no reason why not.
So it's a good metaphor generally for the environmental argument right now.
I think so, yeah.
Essentially. So you mentioned earlier that when you start campaigning, and I know you from the work that you do with Save Our Rivers. So could you explain a little bit about that organisation? You're probably going to laugh that I've used the phrase organisation, but you know what I mean? Like, could you explain a little bit about that? And also, I'm interested in the approach, because am I right in saying that you do find these issues and campaigns to turn your attention to?
Yeah, so we started as I suppose the reason organisation is a strong word is we started as a group of whitewater kayakers that live in Betws-y-Coed, and our local river, which is the River Conway, is one of the best sections of whitewater in the UK, without doubt. And there's a community of sports people who've grown up around that river, and it's produced some of the best whitewater athletes in the country from this one little valley. And then one day RWE, which is a multinational power company, proposed to dam that river and divert the water from the dam 3 kilometers around this stunning gorge, which is the section of river that we like to kayak, but is also home to otter and salmon, and horseshoe bat, and hundreds of species of oceanic bryophyte, and it's a really magical place. And put the water back in around the bottom and leave it, with essentially only 25% of the flow that it would normally have. So we went to a public consultation event that RWE held, and they invited the local kayaking community onto. And they kind of offered us, if we build this dam, then we'll give you some money to build a clubhouse somewhere, or we'll compensate you for this.
Which is presumably a tactic.
Yeah. And then we all walked out of this room and were like, these guys are fuckers. We need to stop them doing this. Yeah. Not only did we feel bullied and patronised, but we felt impassioned to do something about it. And we had a meeting in a pub, and Save Our Rivers was born as a response to this one single issue, and there was a real learning curve for us to work out how we wanted to work as activists, how we were most able to stop this development, how we were able to engage with a community of fishermen, walkers, photographers, local businesses, local residents, who all were also against this, this development, and we ended up with our strategy involved. We would look at the development with a fine-tooth comb. We would pick it apart. We would find areas where its environmental impact was being misrepresented. We would follow planning law as closely as possible, and we would follow the legal recourse of the planning system and the environmental permitting system, and that would be our method for getting this blocked. we weren't the sort of people who felt we were able to go and chain ourselves to a digger or to protest or make a placard. That wasn't the methodology we followed.
Where did that come from then?
I don't really know. I suppose a few of us that are involved in Save Our Rivers have a semi-scientific background. I'm a optometrist by trade, so I've got a science-based degree. My friend Tom, that is my partner in Save Our Rivers, we're the two sort of guys that run that, is a chemistry teacher in the local high school, and it just sort of felt like it fell into our skill set.
Because did you have any experience of campaigning before this?
No, not at all.
So it was very intuitive the way that you decided to take that approach.
Yeah, and I think we made some mistakes in the beginning. I think when you start a campaign and you don't know what you're doing, you sort of load the blunderbuss with tactics and you shoot it at the wall and you see which ones stick, and those are the ones that you follow up, and that's how it worked for us. And then since then, we've taken that same model and applied it to 5 or 6 other hydro schemes. We've applied it to some legislative change that was pushed forward for our national parks. We're now hopefully going to help these guys in Kendal use the same techniques that we've used before. We've had a call from some guys in Norway asking for some support for next year, and it's about rolling. We learnt the hard way, and it was difficult. Our first campaign took 3 years to block this one hydro scheme.
So you were working out your methodology almost.
Yeah, and then the hydro scheme got presented to us in March of this year, and we stopped it within a month, one planning cycle. And it's
almost like a data-led approach, if you like. You try and understand how you can use the massive information that's out there, and a lot of it's legislative, right? You try to understand the legislative playing field, if you like, and so a lot of it's like understanding that and working out how you can use that to your advantage to make the change that you're trying to achieve. That's a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are environmental protection laws out there. Some of them are not strong enough, but actually the real issue is that most of our environmental protection laws, and around rivers, we're talking about Water Framework Directive, which is a European law, are just badly adhered to and, badly regulated.
Yeah.
So we have a legal obligation in the UK under the European Water Framework Directive that all UK rivers should be of good ecological status, or should be working towards being of good ecological status. 14% of UK rivers are of good ecological status. So it just shows that isn't being applied. Whereas if we can see a development and we say it's going to cause a degradation of standards under Water Framework Directive, then we can use that legislation to force the regulator to reject it.
Right. Is that specific to each campaign?
Yeah,
this information that you try to find?
Yeah, so like the latest campaign that we fought against the hydro scheme on the River Clugwy, what we looked at there, the thing that we really pushed on was damage to ancient woodland.
Right.
So ancient woodland is a protected habitat in the UK. So we try and find in each campaign what's the legal point that we can use to sway it. What's the way we can win the argument with the authority.
And it's different every time.
Yeah, it's different every time.
That's what I find really interesting about it, because that's work. I know, I don't need to tell you that, but that is unsexy, like graft, isn't it?
Yeah,
basically. That is like in the trenches, presumably at a computer. You're a dad, you've got a job, we'll get to the kayaking, you're busy, what I mean? Like, so you're presumably doing this in your spare time. And that's what I find really interesting about this, because that's hard work. That's like, but it's working, the way that this methodology that we're talking about, it's, it is working, isn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean, like, I'm not the sort of person who would do it, but I often think, I'd love to be blowing a whistle on the street and marching with a placard and stuff like that. And that would be fantastic. And it looks awesome. And it looks like really good fun. And I'm not taking away from anything that those guys do, because people like Extinction Rebellion, they're raising the awareness of the issues, gives the work that we do more traction.
Sure. And I think that's the importance of that role in this whole narrative, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that really came out from the conversation I had with Jack in the last episode. That flag waving element is totally important, and like you say, but really it's this work that you're talking about that actually then creates the legislative change, which in your case is what you try to achieve, right?
Yeah, totally. And we're trying to change, even if we're just fighting one planning development at a time, we're trying to change the narrative. So we're trying to change people's perception of development in rivers or in wild places, so that the local community become increasingly understanding of the impacts it will have and increasingly against that, and that the planning authority and the environmental regulator will become aware that the local community around them are increasingly concerned about that, and they'll act accordingly. They'll become harder on developers, they'll push for environmental standards more, and they'll reject more cases where there's going to be damage done because the narrative in our whole area has changed around hydropower, for instance. There's a real feeling that hydropower development in Snowdonia has reached capacity and nobody wants any more.
Right.
And that's a new thing.
Right. And how did it work in that first example then? So you said it took 3 years for you to... And was that because, like you say, you were understanding the approach? But can you explain quickly, if it's possible, like how you actually won that one then?
So that one was really hard, and that was because we hadn't changed the narrative yet. So there was pockets of the local community that possibly still didn't understand the impact that hydropower can have. It has a real issue, it is definitely a renewable technology, but it isn't a green renewable technology, which is an awkward concept for people to get at first.
And presumably something the other side can talk about as if it's a very positive thing.
Yeah, definitely. So it gives the developer a way to really push it, and it gives the regulator and the planning authority a way to accept it, even when it's not necessarily in the local area's best interest. So we didn't have that narrative change either amongst the people we were trying to sway the opinion of, which was the planning authority and the regulator, or amongst the local community. And it took us a while to change that. So it ended up, it went to planning. We didn't manage to defeat it at the first planning hearing. We managed to have it rejected for more information to do with aspects of the landscape report that weren't correct and weren't there. And then when it came back it came back to planning again, and then we had to manage to have it rejected, but almost on a technicality, and we won that one by a vote of 6-5, so it was close. And then it came back to planning again, and this time the really good thing was, and this is these stupid techie things that this falls down on, is over this period of time, Natural Resources Wales, which is the regulator, has to write a plan for how its rivers are going to meet Water Framework Directive. And that plan had changed in April. And when it went back to planning, the new planning application was written for the old Water Framework Directive plan. Right. So it was out of date. Right. So it could get blocked purely on that. So it took 3 goes round planning to get it stopped, but it was close. Each time we only just got it, and in the end the developer pulled the plans. So it was never rejected.
They just had enough.
So the planning authority
wore them down.
And I think they were under the impression that the planning authority were going to have to reject it eventually, and so for both the planning authority to save face, because they've been promoting it all the time, the planning officer have been recommending it for approval to the committee each time. Right. And so the company would save face. They pulled the plans in the end. Right. And then the second thing that a hydro development needs is it needs planning approval for the building of the weir, and then it needs its kind of environmental permit, which is I'm allowed to take this water out of the river. Right. And the regulator on that had sat on it for 3 years, waiting to see what planning said. And then as soon as it was pulled from planning, they felt able to reject it. Right. So they had their permit rejected for abstraction, which is water removal, and then they, after pulling their planning up. So it was close. It was a close fought battle, and I was nervous a lot of the time, and I'm quite a competitive person. I don't take losing very well. And also it's a really beautiful place. And I genuinely thought that I'd move away if we'd lost.
There's a lot at stake for you, emotional connection to the place, 3 years work, times competitive spirit. That's definitely can see why you wanted to win, really.
Yeah, and I think when you campaign for a place, your emotional connection to that place builds.
Sure.
So I get an increased appreciation of doing outdoor sport through being an activist.
Yeah.
And it ties you to the place ever closely, but that kind of ups your stake in the game, if you know what I mean. So you feel more committed to the battle.
That must be an advantage, though, right?
Yeah. I think so.
Against who you're lined up against as well, because so I kind of use the phrase "wore them down" because because obviously they must get a point where they think, is it worth this? Like when they see the passion, but also what you've brought to it as an argument, because the other thing that strikes me when you were talking then is that it must be keeping them honest as well, the people that are applying for this stuff a little bit, because it sounds like a lot of what you're looking for is loopholes, like things that haven't been executed correctly at a local government level or an agency level. Is it changing the way that the people that are putting these schemes in are approaching it from the other side?
I think so, yeah. And I think they're much more careful about any literature they put out.
Yeah, they know
that we're going to take everything apart with a fine-tooth comb, and anything that's been worded, maybe favourably, will be spelling out, exactly what that means. So a developer might write of a hydro scheme, the water that we're going to apply to abstract take away from the river is Q95 plus, or 75% over Q95. Nobody knows what that means.
Yeah.
But what that means is they're going to take 75% of the flow of the river above the lowest 5% flow that river ever reaches. So we'll present that in a graph or an example, or, show a picture of what the river looks like at 75% lower than it normally is, because we catch it on a really dry day, and what it should look like on a wet day.
Yeah.
And we can present that in an honest way that people can understand. So the developer has to be much more careful then, because they know we're going to pull them up on that stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's the narrative thing you were talking about earlier, which sounds like was the biggest lesson that you took from that first campaign, that you need to make it something that people can tangibly become emotionally connected to, right? And have a stake in it.
Yeah, definitely.
Above and beyond, like, your homes might flood, or like, the gorge is going to disappear or whatever ultimately. So has that developed as you've got more experience? That are you able to sort of pick that out quite quickly now on the things that you decide to work on?
I think so. I mean, it's difficult because that first application was the biggest one we've ever worked on, and I suppose if it was a little one, we wouldn't have felt passionate enough to get started.
Yeah.
So we've worked on a lot smaller applications since, and quite a big one that was involving some quite complicated wording to legislation change. But I don't think it's picking up on that. I think our method of communicating it with our audience has improved. Our understanding of how to frame what we're trying to say, how to connect with people.
Yeah.
On a level that, I think we may be a bit more mature in how we do that now than we used to be.
Okay.
So that's just learning and growing, I suppose.
So what's driving you with this then? Because obviously you did the first one and it was successful, but then you've carried on campaigning and finding different things to apply this approach to. So was there a point when you kind of thought, I'm just going to keep going with this, or?
It was a really cool moment, actually. So the environmental permit for the first one had been pulled, and this happened about 3 months after planning was withdrawn. I had all my mates around the house that had worked on the campaign. So there's Tom and I that are that run the campaign, and we've got 5 or 6 other guys and girls that really help us out. And one of them's a graphic designer and can do work for us there. One's a copywriter, so he can help with our website writing. And so we've got one of them's a trainee lawyer, and he's really helpful with legislative stuff. And they help us out. And we were having a big party, drinking pizza and eating beer and drinking pizza or whatever at my house. And it was Friday night, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, and I get a phone call from a guy called John Harold. Now, John Harold runs the Snowdonia Society in Snowdonia National Park. It's like a Friends of the National Park Society. And from the very beginning, he was our biggest ally and a real mentor to me as well, because he came from a traditional environmentalist background. And he said, I'm going to email you a document now. It's about legislative changes to our national parks. It's a leaked copy of a draft document which is going to remove the main environmental protection from Welsh national parks.
Right.
It's being discussed in the Welsh Assembly on Tuesday, and none of the Assembly members, which is the Welsh version of an MP, basically, none of the Assembly members have even seen what it's based on. And he says this is a disaster, and if this goes through, Welsh national parks won't be national parks anymore under their IUCN rating, which is
What was driving that then? Sorry to interrupt you, but
what was driving that was,
because that sounds shady.
It was really shady, and it was being driven by a particularly unpleasant environment minister that we had at the time, who even renamed his role from environment minister to Minister for Natural Resources, which I think pretty much says everything.
Minister
in one title.
for rinsing on behalf of the...
And it was to allow more development and almost more extractive income from our national park areas, whether that's planting commercial forestry or whether that's building more hydro schemes or, there's a whole number of ways that this change could have taken place. And this guy from the Snowdonia Society was like, oh, we need to do something about this. This was 10 o'clock at night. By 3 a.m. that morning, we had template letters for every person that we could reach in Wales to write to their assembly member with a copy of this draft report to show what was happening. And we had a campaign up and running, and during 11 p.m. through till 3 a.m. in the morning, and we got it going. And there was nothing more rewarding than watching the live debate on TV, and AM standing up is like, I don't agree with this, and reading from a letter that I knew we templated, and it stopped it in its tracks. And then that was only the draft proposal, and then the full proposal came out. So it ended up being a much longer battle. But that event, had we lost it at that early stage, and that was where we thought, us not working office hours, us being willing to do this at midnight or 1 a.m., us having a community of, I don't know what we reach through social media, about 7,000 people who are really engaged with what we do, and maybe 10,000 people who sort of follow us a bit. If we can reach these guys and get them to respond in an instant, then we need to keep doing this. We've got a responsibility to keep doing this.
Right. So you felt like you kind of, because obviously that must have really given you the realization of the scope of it. Because to escalate from a local to a national level like that, and such an important thing, it must have been like you say, like a bit of a light bulb moment. Yeah,
definitely. And in the campaign against the national park legislation changes, we called our campaign National Parks Matter. It was great because we were working alongside the Snowdonia Society, the Woodland Trust, the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, and then all of a sudden there's us, with all the big players, the traditional conservation groups, and we had a very different but important role to play within that, which was what I saw was bringing outdoor sports enthusiasts to environmental issues and getting them to act. And I felt that that's something that has been missing, and until recently, and although it's happening a lot more now, I still think it's lacking.
So what can be done to change that?
I think it should be a mindset amongst people who engage in outdoor sport. I think if you play outside, you've got to understand that the space you play in isn't just a playground. It's the last vestiges of the wild habitats that we have in the UK or Europe.
It's a political space today.
Yeah,
I mean that's the point. And you might not think it is, or you might not think it's relevant to you, but the fact of the matter is, as we're talking about, it is a political battleground, and it is. Yeah, I mean you've outlined that, with 5 different examples already.
Yeah. And we have to understand our place in that, and it's my personal feeling that as an outdoor sports person, my vision for that area is far closer to its natural state than a commercial forester's vision for that area, or a hydro developer's vision for that area, or a housing developer's vision for that area. And although it might feel slightly selfish that we want to preserve it that way to do our sport, in all honesty, that's the state that place should be in.
Yeah, it's much more sympathetic, isn't it, to the natural state of it?
Yeah, definitely.
So do you think, because there's a lot of organisations that purport to have that approach, that, but it sounds like you think that it could be more successful, or it could be applied in a more targeted way, let's say.
In terms of traditional conservation,
in terms of like you talking about participants being empowered to have a voice in this,
Yeah, and I think there is definitely a growing movement of outdoor sports activists. Like, we were just listening to Dom from Trash Free Trails on the stage there, who's a friend of both of ours, and is pushing mountain bikers to be more responsible with their,
Protect Our Winters is an obvious one.
Yeah, Protect Our Winters. Surfers Against Sewage were the first version of this, and Chris Hines is an absolute legend, and Hugo is as well now, and Hugo has been a real mentor to me as well through the interactions I've had with him. But there is still a gap, that we're not hitting. And if we're not hitting 100% of outdoor sports participants being environmentalists, then we're short. It has to be, the environment has to be first and foremost in our mind whenever we're in that space. And we have to think, what can we do to protect that? And it can't just be, as important as it is, I'll pick up a bit of litter, or as important as it is, I'll sign this petition. Sometimes the activism that you've got to do is boring, and it's a grind, and it involves sitting in front of your computer and writing a letter for an hour or reading some documents. But we have to eat into the time that we have to go and enjoy those spaces to protect them. You've got to kind of accept that sometimes you've got to put the work in to get the joy out of it.
Do you get frustrated by? I'm not sure you probably do, knowing you a little bit. But is it frustrating? Because what you're talking about is the potential that the movement's got. Really, if you frame it in that way, like if you can get that buy-in from people, because like you say, we're at Kendal. This is the constituency, isn't it? And I'm sure if you spoke to everybody here, they would say like they were an environmentalist, they had an interest in sustainability, but it's taken that, I'm not going to use lifestyle position because that's probably a bit harsh, to up a notch to actual change and activism, isn't it? That's going to make a difference. Definitely.
And we see it in terms of the actions that we ask people to carry out are not easy. We don't generally run petitions for people to sign. We want people to write objections to planning responses, and we will give them all the information about that planning application and what needs to be included, but we won't do a letter for them to just send, because that will have a lower impact when we send it. Letters need to be individual. They need to highlight your concerns, and it's going to take someone 20 minutes, half an hour to do that. It's not straightforward. And we'll look at, we had a petition run against the damming of the River Conway, and we hit something like 7,000 signatures really quick. That's great. But we only had 750 individualized letters written in. Why didn't all of those 7,000 people spend 20 minutes to write a letter? We reached more people than that in the outdoor sports movement is huge. Why didn't they all write a letter? And that conversion rate needs to be higher. And we can do what we can in terms of messaging better. That's our responsibility, making it as easy as we can for people. But in the end, people just have to make an effort, and lots of people do, but it could always be more. And it isn't just that the environment would benefit from that. I genuinely believe by campaigning and being an activist to protect somewhere, you understand that place more, you enjoy that place more, and it changes your relationship with it. And my relationship with my sport and the places I do it has, multiplied tenfold.
That's why I think it's a really positive message, though, because again, one of the themes that's coming up in these Type 2 podcasts is this idea that there's a lot of guilt involved in talking about things that need to change, and like things you've got to give up. Things you've got to give up this part of your lifestyle to make change. And what I really like about this is it's actually a very positive thing. It's like positive action on the issue level, but also, like you're saying, on the personal level, because it's win-win, really. You get to do something positive, you get to affect an issue, and you get to basically feel better about yourself and enjoy the thing that you're doing even more. And obviously for you, it's intrinsically linked to your passion for kayaking. I mean, that's where it came from, and that seems to be what is at the root of driving it, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. We were talking about this a little bit with people and their connection to the River Kent at the talk that we did last night, and I feel that increasingly as a society we're becoming disconnected from nature. Nature is responsible for all our clean air, all our clean water, all our food, the oxygen we breathe. It's the only repository for the carbon that we're putting out. 60% of our emissions are recaptured by the environment. We're in trouble because the other 40% are, and we need to stop emitting those. So we're thoroughly dependent on nature for our survival, but there's this sort of interface between us. It stops us connecting with it. But kayaking is such a intrinsic journey down a free-flowing river that you feel connected with nature in a way that breaks down all those barriers, and that's what's driven my desire to become an activist, I suppose. And I sometimes feel when I would paddle the gorge on the Conway that we were protecting, I would just sometimes feel that, and it's a fairly tricky place to get into. It's not an easy bit of whitewater, and it was unfortunately, the preserve of a relatively select few to travel that little passage. And I often thought, if we could just get people to be here and just do this, they'd throw this damn application out in a second if they could see this place for what it is. And I think that's the same when you human power snowboard, when you like split board up somewhere and you snowboard somewhere where there's no lift lines and there's no snow blowing machines and there's no cafe at the bottom. You feel that connection to a place in a way that's different and connects you to it in a way that you feel a sense of responsibility for it, I think.
So one question I always ask people on this, and I mean you have probably covered it anyway, but I will ask it. What can people do that are inspired by this conversation?
I think the thing that we've tried to show is that activism takes many forms. My activism is mostly sat in front of a computer screen, drinking like 8 cups of coffee and listening to EDM, and that's how it works.
Forgot about the EDM.
Yeah, I have a whole collection of really bad dance music that keeps me awake at night while I write, because there's no lyrics. I can concentrate on reading at the same time.
What? I have that as well. When I've got to concentrate. This is such a tangent. I find a type of kind of almost like abrasive music.
Yeah,
like really helps.
I'm like Lindstrom's my big if you want to read an entire environmental impact assessment, bit of Lindstrom, that's great.
Yeah,
have that on
kind of for me it's like the more unlistenable Aphex Twin or something.
Yeah,
whatever. It's funny how your brain works, isn't it? It's almost like it's white noise that kind of lets you focus.
I think if I was listening to Aphex Twin, my letters would be more rowdy. It might not be so balanced. I need something relatively neutral in tone to get through it.
Yeah.
And that's my form of activism.
Sure.
And some people's forms of activism is getting out and marching. And some people's forms of activism is working on direct conservation projects where they're planting trees or they're rebuilding rivers. And what I want people to understand is that those are 3 forms I've listed. There are other forms that's maybe not even been discovered yet. Maybe someone's got an idea of how to make an impact at a higher level that I haven't thought of and nobody else has thought of. And that doesn't mean to say that it's wrong. Do something, do it the way you think. If you've got an idea, you chase it, because you can build your own movement. We've seen that recently, with Extinction Rebellion and climate strikes. The movement that's being built there is enormous. Our movement is much, much smaller, but it has a much more amplified voice per person because of the way we work. But do something. Work on your skill set. There's a really good friend of mine, Rock Rosman, who's a kayaker in the Balkans, who does campaigning there, says you don't need to be a scientist to be an environmentalist. You just need to be a human with a voice, and how you use that voice is up to you.
What a pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much, man. So there you go. That was my episode of Type 2 with Dan of Save Our Rivers. Hope you enjoyed it. Big thanks to Dan for coming on the show and overcoming his obvious aversion to having his photo taken on my behalf. Cheers, Dan. Appreciate that. You can find out more about Dan and his work over at saveourrivers.org. And I hope you were able to take some lessons from this one that you can use in your own approach to activism. Now, I'd also like to draw your attention to show sponsor Patagonia's Gift of Giving campaign, which is running until December the 31st, 2019. So here's how it works. If you donate to any environmental group over on the Patagonia Action Works site, Patagonia will match your donation. You can make a donation in your own name or in the name of somebody else if you want to gift that. So let's just look at the example of Save Our Rivers. Let's say you listened to this, you were impressed, and you thought you were going to lob them a tenner. Patagonia are also going to give them a tenner if you donate through their Action Works Gift of Giving program, and Save Our Rivers are going to get 20 quid. So they're going to match donations up to $10,000, I believe, and the fund in total is $10 million, which obviously has the power to make a huge difference to a lot of these campaigns on a local level. Find out more and potentially donate over at eu.patagonia.com/actionworks. Sweet. That's it for this week. I'll be releasing new episodes of Type 2 every month or so. They do appear in my usual Looking Sideways channel. So to listen, you need to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your usual podcast purveyor. If it's your first time checking out what I do, there's a big old back catalogue on there of normal Looking Sideways episodes. And I'm also racking up a few Type 2 episodes now. All in all, we've got over 100 episodes of interviews with some of the biggest names in action sports and other related endeavours. So get stuck in. Let me know what you think. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Nice one.